Shaun Ansari here with the Institute of Business Management, and in this course we're going to give you a introduction to Blender 3D. And in the first video we're going to be talking about a little bit about the housekeeping, how the course is structured, and then segue into the history of animation and what its origins are. I will then go over and discuss some of the other 3D packages and sort of get you started towards learning and getting an introduction to Blender 3D. Alright, so just a basic introduction of what 3D is. 3D is, simply put, three-dimensional. So 3D art and animation is where objects that you create can be moved not only on the X and Y axis, but also on the Z axis. So you can see down here, X is left and right, Y is top and down, and Z is towards or away from you. Now, usually when you're working with Photoshop, or if you're drawing on sort of paint, for example, in your computer, you can only move objects on sort of a two-dimensional plane. So you either move it right or you move it left. 3D art and 3D packages allow you to manipulate objects in the Z axis. That's why it's called 3D. So you can see here, I've given you three examples of three-dimensional versus two-dimensional. You can see in the first image from Frozen, you can see the difference between a two-dimensional drawing or rendering and a three-dimensional rendering. There's a lot of depth in a 3D one. So that is basically what we meant when we earlier discussed the Z axis. There's data, there's information that's between you and the computer and on that plane. So you can see 2D versus 3D, two-dimensional art is not necessarily flat, but it lacks the third dimension, the depth that you get. Now you can get shadows in 2D, but 3D art, notably, as you can see by these examples, looks very different. Right. So just let's now talk about how 3D has evolved over the years. In 1967, the hummingbird animation was produced, and this was decades before Toy Story. It was 30,000 images, and all of this motion of this hummingbird was generated by a computer. So if you have time after viewing this video, you can go check it out on YouTube. It's a very basic a basic view into the origins of 3D animation. Then we fast forward to 1982, where Tron had about a 15-minute 3D animated sequence where these light cycles in the movie were fighting each other and driving around. Disney remade Tron later on with a much more attractive 3D sequence. But if you also have time, like I said before, you can go on YouTube and you can check out this older light cycle sequence from 1982, where they also used 3D modeled objects, and they were animating these using a software package in 1982. But you can see this is very different from the hummingbird, which almost looks like they just moved these two-dimensional images. We see over time packages get more advanced, techniques improve, and then you have something that looks a little bit more like an object in a computer. But keep in mind, again, while this may look very basic today, this was in 1982. Then you fast forward to modern 3D animated productions like Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Frozen, How to Train Your Dragon. These, of course, have undergone decades of development in 3D. So the packages and the tools that artists and producers use to make these movies have undergone a lot of development. So we have developments in color, in animation, in rendering, in lighting. So on all fronts, these 3D packages have come from this to this. That's just basically why it's important to know where 3D comes from and how there's always development being done in three-dimensional, like in the three-dimensional research sort of realm. All right, so now let's talk about what 3D animation is made with, because earlier I mentioned that lighting, rendering, modeling, animation, these are all components, these are all techniques that are done in a 3D animated software package. So now we're going to just briefly discuss some of the common names that you'll hear online, because a common question that some of you might have is, why are we learning Blender? Why don't we learn A? Why don't we learn B? I've heard A is better than B. This is a very common question that people that are starting, students that are starting 3D animation ask, is A better than B? Is B better than C? There's a number of packages that do 3D animation, and it's important to know a few of the more popular ones just so you understand that they all kind of do the same thing. It will ultimately come down to what you are most comfortable with, and that is the best advice I've heard over the years, is that don't think of one package being better than the other package. Think of always go with the package that you're most comfortable with. All right, so let's start with Autodesk Maya. So Maya is one of the oldest, and it's kind of the industry standard for 3D animation, and it's seen its use in many productions worldwide. So you can see bottom right here of the screen is the user interface of Maya. It's got a little astronaut giving a thumbs up. So it's very powerful, and it's used by many studios, and almost all mid to expert level 3D artists have used Maya or can use Maya to some degree. So Maya is very old, very powerful. It's still being used everywhere, and it is very, very adopted in the industry. But some of its downsides are it is paid and can be expensive, and it has a very steep learning curve. So usually, like when I was in university, I struggled a lot with learning Maya, because if you are just thrown into Maya right off the bat, like if your initial sort of venture into 3D is with Maya, it can be difficult for some people, including me. It was very difficult for me to learn Maya when I started learning 3D. Now I'm a lot more comfortable with it because I understand it, and it's been a lot of years, but Maya can have a very steep learning curve. 3D Studio Max is the second example I want to talk about. It's another old industry heavyweight. It's been used for years, and it was quite popular with people from the games and special effects industry. So fire animations, sort of fire simulations. When I say simulation, I really mean how the fire flows and how it interacts with objects around it. So that's what I mean when I say simulation. So the games industry and the special effects industry used 3D Studio Max to a very, very, they used it a lot back in the day, and they still do. So 3D Studio Max is another software package that is still around and still being used, and very, very powerful simulation and water tools and great modeling tools. But again, some of its downsides are it is paid and can be expensive, and its workflow takes a little time to get used to. It's a bit different from Maya. Maya has a different workflow. You can see by its interface example that I've got here on the bottom right. But 3D Studio Max has a bit of a different workflow, and it takes some getting used to. All right, so number 3 that we're going to talk about today is Maxon Cinema 4D. Now, this is a motion graphics powerhouse. So the previous 2 examples are very good with animations. They sort of have their grounding, their base in animation. But whereas Maxon Cinema 4D came a bit later compared to the previous 2. It's a bit more recent as well, and it is very, very useful for motion graphics. Now, what do I mean when I say motion graphics? I mean making text move, making little like colors change, animations. So Cinema 4D has seen a lot of adoption in motion graphics. So like commercials, product animation, like a bottle opening, or like headphones disassembling and reassembling. So Cinema 4D is definitely it's a lot more recent. I would say it's relatively recent, and it has got amazing motion graphics tools, a very nice render engine. It's very popular with solo motion designers. So a lot of the 3D videos that you might see on Instagram will come from Cinema 4D. It is paid, can be a little expensive, but not as expensive as Maya and 3ds Max. But it doesn't have any native simulation tools. So if you wanted to do water and fire, you would have to get plugins for it. So right out of the box, it can't do any sort of liquid simulation, which is not a problem, but it's a nice software package, and definitely my second pick after Blender. All right, so let's talk about the package we're going to be learning in this course. So Blender 3D is a open source free animation software package that we're going to be learning in this course. And open source and free is amazing because Blender has always been free, and it will always continue to stay free. Anyone can go sign up and download it. It's designed to be open source and for anyone to use. But over the last couple of years, it's been gaining in popularity because its power has been increasing. It can do things better. Its render engine has improved. Its lighting has improved. And the Blender Foundation is always adding new features to Blender, and you can see that on its website. You can see that they're constantly trying to push Blender forward, and it had its recent biggest update with Blender 2.8, where they overhauled the user interface. They made it a lot more cleaner. Blender 2.9 has more features being added, and because of these features being added, because Blender getting so powerful, its adoption has improved, has become more widespread rather in various industries. Previously, when you would mention Blender, people would be a little like, why are you learning Blender? Why Blender? Why not learn something else? But now you're seeing more and more people do powerful things with powerful and great things with Blender, and it's being used on films, games, motion graphics, even 2D animated art. So over the last couple of years, Blender's adoption has increased, and right now it's just been exponentially increasing. A lot of packages like Unreal Engine are working on plugins for Blender. And so you have it being used all the way, not only in just 3D animation, but also in games, movies, and virtual production. So while Blender does have its own unique workflow, so it does have a unique way of doing things. The good thing about Blender is that this course and the way we learn Blender will allow you to apply these techniques to any package. So for example, when we learn lighting in Blender, you can apply that to lighting in Cinema 4D or Maya or 3ds Max. When we learn texturing or color in Blender, or for example, when we learn the basics of modeling in Blender, you can then use the same things that we learn, because Blender kind of uses the same terminology. So you can take those techniques that we talk about in this course, and you can apply them to another software package. So for example, if you wanted to learn like Cinema 4D, you can then, your learning curve into Cinema 4D might be a little less, it won't be as steep as if you were just jumping into Cinema 4D or Maya, for example, just because you've done some things in Blender already. So that's the good thing about Blender. Some of the things it does is interchangeable with other 3D software packages. And let's just go to the next slide. So just talking about the course structure here, how we've designed the course. At the beginning of the week, you will have a video which is going to be discussing the technique that is going to be taught and expected to be viewed and then studied. Now, the video, of course, the purpose of it being pre-recorded is that you can watch it at leisure, and it doesn't require you to have it available for a specific time. So you can watch the video, view it, and then study it. And then over that particular week, you're expected to practice what the video explains. So if that particular week we're talking about a concept like texturing or modeling or lighting, you're expected to watch the video, study it, and then over that week, practice what's being discussed in that video. So for example, if we would talk about modeling, if I give you the basics of modeling in the introduction video for that week, I'm expecting you to, over that week, sort of practice modeling, model something else, get comfortable with modeling. So the reason for this is mentioned in point 3. So I want you to try and avoid rushing the course. So it's very easy to give into the temptation of finishing the course quickly and then say, hey, I know Blender. But one of the problems that sort of sets you up for is that because you've only recently learned it and haven't practiced it, you haven't committed that information to memory. And what sort of problem that you run into then is that you end up spending more time searching on the internet how to do something and less time actually making your art, or less time animating your project. So one of the advice I would give you would be, study the video, take time, practice it to the T. Practice it every 2 days if you don't have time, but practice what the video explains and then go on to the next video. So try and avoid rushing the course. It takes time to learn 3D, and pace yourself just so that you can get comfortable with the techniques that have been introduced. And then, like I spoke about earlier, the more you practice, the more you subconsciously commit these workflows to your brain. And then you have less time figuring out how to do something and more time just trying to create your art. Because think of a situation in which you're trying to create something that's in your head and you don't know how to do it in Blender. You're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out and research and search how to make something. But if you've studied a few of the components and you're comfortable with it, just when you think about it in your head, you will know how to make that in Blender because you've already practiced the various workflows that Blender does to create something, right? And after a couple of weeks, usually it's about 2, quizzes are going to be administered to check your progress, just to make sure that you've learned and practiced what's being taught in the videos. That was a brief discussion about the history of animation as well as some discussion about comparing different 3D software packages. Now in the next video, we're going to talk about the Blender user interface.